Number 1. Kwame Kilpatrick. He was called the hip-hop mayor, young, charismatic, and chosen to save Detroit. Instead, Kwame Kilpatrick turned City Hall into his personal cash machine, and what he did would send shockwaves far beyond the Motor City. Kwame Kilpatrick seemed destined for greatness from the start. Born in 1970 to a politically connected family in Detroit, his mother, Carolyn, served in Congress, paving the way for her son's ambitions. Kilpatrick was a star student, a college football captain, and earned his law degree by 1999. At just 31 years old, he became the youngest mayor in Detroit's history in 2002. He married his high school sweetheart, Carlita, and they had 3 sons together. The city embraced him as their bold new leader who would revitalize a struggling metropolis. He wore diamond-studded earrings to press conferences and drove around in luxury vehicles. The image was carefully crafted, successful, confident, untouchable. But behind the polished exterior, Kilpatrick was running an elaborate criminal enterprise. For 6 years, he operated what federal prosecutors would later call a pay-to-play system that corrupted nearly every major city contract. At the center of it all was Bobby Ferguson, Kilpatrick's childhood friend and construction contractor. The scheme was brutally simple. If you wanted to do business with Detroit, you had to cut Ferguson in on the deal. If you refused, the city would make sure your company never saw another contract. Contractors were extorted, intimidated, and squeezed for kickbacks. The mayor wasn't just bending the rules, he was shattering them for profit. And the money flowed like a river. Kilpatrick used over $840,000 in cash derived from this conspiracy to fund a lifestyle that would make a Fortune 500 executive blush. Private jets, luxury resort vacations, designer clothing, golf clubs, spa treatments for his wife. All while Detroit residents struggled with crumbling infrastructure and underfunded services. He even tapped nonprofit funds meant to help distressed citizens to pay for yoga lessons and summer camps for his children. The betrayal was staggering in its scope and audacity. The walls began closing in when journalists and federal investigators started connecting the dots. Text messages between Kilpatrick and his chief of staff revealed lies told under oath. A 2008 perjury conviction forced him to resign as mayor and serve 99 days in jail. But that was just the appetizer. The FBI had been quietly building something much bigger. A massive racketeering case codenamed Operation Board Games. Agents combed through financial records, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and followed the money trail that led straight back to the mayor's office. By 2010, Kilpatrick's claims of poverty rang hollow when investigators discovered he couldn't explain who paid for his million-dollar home and fleet of Cadillac Escalades. In March 2013, after a 5-month trial, a federal jury convicted Kilpatrick on 24 felony counts. The charges read like a greatest hits of corruption: racketeering, extortion, bribery, mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. His father Bernard and friend Bobby Ferguson were also convicted for their roles in the conspiracy. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming: financial records, cooperating witnesses, recorded conversations. The defense argued that gifts from supporters weren't bribes, but the jury wasn't buying it. When the verdicts were read, Kilpatrick showed no emotion. He'd gambled that his charm and connections would save him. He'd lost. 7 months later, Judge Nancy Edmonds delivered a sentence that shook the legal world: 28 years in federal prison. It was one of the harshest penalties ever handed down to a public official for corruption. The judge noted that Kilpatrick had shown a pattern of intimidation, threats, and bullying, and called his crimes a betrayal of public trust during Detroit's most vulnerable period. He was also ordered to pay restitution, though victims would never be made fully whole. Kilpatrick served 7 years before President Donald Trump commuted his sentence in January 2021, just hours before leaving office. Today, he walks free, claiming redemption and transformation. But the scars he left on Detroit remain: a city that trusted him with everything, only to watch him steal it blind. Next, we travel to Illinois, where another politician thought he could sell a Senate seat to the highest bidder. Number 2. Rod Blagojevich. "I've got this thing and it's golden, and I'm just not giving it up for nothing." Those words, caught on an FBI wiretap, would end a governor's career and expose one of the most brazen corruption schemes in American political history. Rod Blagojevich grew up in a working-class Chicago neighborhood, the son of a Serbian immigrant steelworker. He boxed as a teenager, worked his way through law school, and possessed the kind of street-smart charisma that played well in Illinois politics. In 1996, he married Patricia Mell, daughter of a powerful Chicago alderman, connecting him to the city's political machine. Blagojevich served in Congress before running for governor in 2002, positioning himself as a reformer who would clean up Illinois' notoriously corrupt system. He won easily, becoming the state's first Democratic governor in 26 years. With his signature mop of dark hair and populist rhetoric, he seemed like a breath of fresh air. The irony would later be impossible to ignore, but Blagojevich wasn't interested in reform. He was interested in enrichment. Almost from day one, he began treating his office like a commodity exchange. State contracts went to the highest bidder. Appointments to lucrative boards required hefty campaign contributions. Want a favorable decision from a state agency? That'll cost you. He shook down a children's hospital CEO, suggesting that state funding might dry up unless donations started flowing to his campaign. He pressured a racetrack owner, hinting that legislation helpful to their business depended on financial support. The governor's office had become a toll booth, and Blagojevich was collecting at every turn. Then came November 2008, and everything changed. Barack Obama won the presidency, leaving his Illinois Senate seat vacant. Under state law, the governor had the power to appoint Obama's replacement. For most officials, this would be a solemn civic duty. For Blagojevich, it was a jackpot. What he didn't know was that the FBI had been wiretapping his phones for months as part of an investigation codenamed Operation Board Games. Agents listened in stunned silence as the governor openly discussed selling the Senate seat to the highest bidder. He considered appointing himself. He floated schemes to trade the appointment for a cabinet position in the Obama administration. He discussed securing a high-paying job at a nonprofit in exchange for naming a particular candidate. On those recorded calls, his language was crude and his intentions unmistakable. The Senate seat was for sale. December 9, 2008, started like any other morning at the governor's mansion. Then FBI agents knocked on the door at 6:15 a.m. Blagojevich was arrested in his home, still in his workout clothes, and led away in handcuffs. The criminal complaint detailed a staggering pattern of corruption spanning his entire tenure as governor. Federal prosecutors called it a political corruption crime spree. Those wiretap recordings would prove devastating. They captured Blagojevich in his own words, scheming and plotting without a shred of shame. The public was outraged. Politicians from both parties demanded his resignation. He refused. On January 29, 2009, the Illinois House of Representatives voted 114-1 to impeach him. The state Senate followed suit, voting unanimously to remove him from office. Blagojevich became the first governor in Illinois history to be impeached and thrown out. But the legal troubles were just beginning. His first federal trial in 2010 ended in a hung jury on most counts. Prosecutors regrouped and tried again. In June 2011, after 14 days of deliberations, a jury convicted him on 17 of 20 corruption charges, including wire fraud, attempted extortion, conspiracy, and solicitation of bribes. The defense had argued that political horse trading was just business as usual in Illinois. The jury disagreed. On December 7, 2011, Judge James Zagel sentenced Blagojevich to 14 years in federal prison, calling his crimes a crime spree and a destruction of the public trust. Blagojevich sobbed as he was led away to begin his sentence at a Colorado federal prison. He served nearly 8 years before President Trump commuted his sentence in February 2020. Blagojevich walked out of prison still claiming innocence, still blaming prosecutors, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. Illinois, meanwhile, added another name to its shameful list of governors sent to prison. Our next story takes us south to Louisiana, where a legendary political figure known as the Cajun King spent decades dancing on the edge of corruption before finally falling over. Number 3. Edwin Edwards. The only way I can lose this election is if I'm caught in bed with either a dead girl or a live boy. Edwin Edwards said that with a straight face during a campaign, and the crowd roared with laughter. He was untouchable, invincible, the Cajun King of Louisiana politics. Until he wasn't. Edwin Washington Edwards was born in 1927 in rural Louisiana to a sharecropper father and a French-speaking Catholic mother. He served in World War II, earned a law degree, and entered politics with a magnetic smile and razor-sharp wit. He spoke both English and Cajun French fluently, connecting with voters across cultural lines. Edwards served in Congress before winning the governorship in 1971, eventually serving 4 terms spanning from 1972 to 1996, more elected terms than any other Louisiana governor. He was brilliant, funny, and utterly fearless. He openly loved high-stakes gambling in Las Vegas, expensive suits, and beautiful women. His personal life was tabloid gold, divorcing his wife of 40 years, marrying a woman 35 years his junior, and constantly pushing boundaries. Voters loved him anyway. He had an almost supernatural ability to survive scandal after scandal. And there were plenty of scandals. Throughout his career, Edwards dodged investigation after investigation. Federal grand juries examined his finances in the 1970s. No charges. Associates were indicted around him. He walked free. In 1985, he was charged with racketeering related to hospital certifications, acquitted. Critics called him the Teflon governor because nothing stuck. He seemed legally invincible, always one step ahead of prosecutors. But in his final term during the mid-1990s, Edwards made a fatal miscalculation. Louisiana had just legalized riverboat casino gambling, and securing one of those coveted licenses meant instant wealth. Edwards saw opportunity. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Businessmen seeking casino licenses would have to pay Edwards and his associates under the table to receive approval. It wasn't about qualifications or merit. It was about cash. Edwards and his son Stephen, along with several cronies, demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for gaming licenses worth millions. When Eddie DeBartolo Jr., owner of the San Francisco 49ers, applied for a license, Edwards allegedly demanded $400,000. DeBartolo later told investigators he felt extorted. Edwards' own lawyer described clients being shaken down systematically. The conspiracy netted the governor nearly $3 million in bribes. He lived lavishly while selling access to Louisiana's gaming industry piece by piece. The FBI finally had enough. For nearly 3 years, they planted listening devices in Edwards' law office and wiretapped his home phone. They called the investigation Operation Riverboat. Agents recorded hundreds of conversations, building an airtight case brick by brick. In 1998, federal prosecutors indicted Edwards on racketeering charges. The trial in 2000 lasted 17 weeks, with prosecutors presenting damning testimony from co-conspirators who'd flipped. DeBartolo testified that he'd paid the bribe out of fear. Other witnesses described Edwards' control over the licensing process and the explicit quid pro quo arrangements. Edwards took the stand in his own defense, trying once again to charm his way out of trouble. He dismissed the bribery allegations as ridiculous, even joking that if he were going to extort DeBartolo, he'd have demanded $40 million, not a mere $400,000. The jury wasn't laughing. On May 9, 2000, they convicted Edwards on 17 counts, including racketeering, extortion, mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. His son Stephen was also convicted. At 72 years old, the Cajun king had finally been dethroned. 8 months later, on January 8, 2001, Judge Frank Polizzola sentenced Edwards to 10 years in federal prison and fined him $250,000. He was also ordered to forfeit $1.8 million. The prosecutor noted that Edwards had damaged Louisiana's reputation for decades, making the state synonymous with corruption. Edwards reported to federal prison in October 2002. Even behind bars, he remained defiant, maintaining his innocence and filing appeals. He served 8 years before being released in January 2011 to a halfway house. At 83, he married his prison pen pal Trina Grimes, a woman 51 years his junior who'd written him letters while he was incarcerated. They later had a child together and starred in a reality TV show. Edwards died in July 2021 at age 93, still claiming he'd done nothing wrong. Louisiana voters, in a poll taken shortly after his release, named him one of the state's best governors. Next, we visit New Orleans, where a mayor who'd guided the city through Hurricane Katrina was secretly profiting from its reconstruction. Number 4. Ray Nagin Hurricane. Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, and the nation watched as Mayor Ray Nagin stood before cameras pleading for help, his voice breaking with emotion. He became the face of a city drowning. What nobody knew was that while the floodwaters receded, Nagin was quietly turning the city's recovery into his personal payday. Ray Nagin wasn't a typical politician. Born in 1956 in New Orleans, he grew up in a working-class family. His father worked 2 jobs. His mother managed a Kmart restaurant. Nagin earned his college degree, served briefly in the Air National Guard, and built a successful corporate career as an executive at Cox Communications. He had no political background when he entered the 2002 mayoral race as a complete outsider, a businessman who promised to run the city like a company. Voters, tired of the old political machine, embraced him. He won in a landslide. Nagin was articulate, confident, and brought a fresh perspective. He called himself a reformer who would clean up corruption. The local newspaper endorsed him, and the business community rallied behind him. Then Katrina struck, and Nagin became a national figure overnight. But behind the scenes, Nagin had already begun building his corruption empire. The scheme started subtly. Businessmen seeking city contracts would approach the mayor with proposals, and with gifts. Luxury vacations appeared. First-class plane tickets materialized. A trip to Hawaii for the family, another to Jamaica. Private jet flights to New York City with limousine service waiting on the tarmac. Free granite for his personal business ventures, cell phone service paid for by contractors. It wasn't random generosity, it was investment. These businessmen expected returns, and Nagin delivered. City contracts worth millions flowed to those who'd greased the mayor's palm. After Katrina, the corruption accelerated. New Orleans desperately needed rebuilding, and federal money poured in. Nagin saw opportunity in the chaos. His partnerships became more brazen, more lucrative. He worked closely with technology vendors who essentially ran the city's IT operations while showering him with benefits. He helped his son's granite business, Stone Age LLC, by leaning on contractors to purchase from them and arranging favorable deals with Home Depot. He accepted over $500,000 in bribes, trips, and property, all while telling devastated residents that help was coming. The mayor who demanded accountability from Washington was accountable to no one himself. The Metropolitan Crime Commission, a watchdog group, began noticing irregularities in 2009 during an audit of the city's crime camera system. Financial discrepancies didn't add up. They alerted the FBI, and federal agents opened an investigation. For years, investigators quietly built their case, following money trails, interviewing witnesses, and documenting the web of corruption. Technology vendors started cooperating, providing testimony about the bribery arrangements. Business records revealed payments disguised as consulting fees and legitimate expenses. The evidence mounted steadily. In January 2013, a federal grand jury indicted Nagin on 21 counts, including bribery, wire fraud, money laundering, and filing false tax returns. He was the first New Orleans mayor in history to face corruption charges while in office. Nagin pleaded not guilty, maintaining his innocence throughout. His trial began in January 2014, and prosecutors methodically dismantled his defense. Witnesses testified about explicit quid pro quo arrangements, money and gifts in exchange for contracts and favorable treatment. Emails and financial documents proved the connections. Former associates who'd already cut deals with prosecutors described how the system operated. Nagin's attorney argued these were legitimate business relationships, not bribes, but the jury saw through it. On February 12, 2014, after days of deliberation, they convicted him on 20 of 21 counts. Nagin showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. 5 months later, on July 9, 2014, Judge Helen Ginger Berrigan sentenced Nagin to 10 years in federal prison. She also ordered him to pay $84,264 in restitution to the IRS and forfeit over $500,000. The judge noted that Nagin had betrayed New Orleans when the city was most vulnerable. Exploiting a disaster for personal gain, he'd turned public service into a profit center during a crisis. Nagin reported to a federal prison camp in Texas in September 2014. He served just over 6 years before being released early in April 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic. He completed probation in March 2024, posting on social media, "Free at last." But his freedom came with conditions and a permanent stain on his legacy. The mayor who'd cried on television about his suffering city had been the one inflicting wounds all along. Our next case takes us to Alabama, where a governor's prosecution became one of the most controversial corruption cases in modern American history. Number 5. Don Siegelman. He was the only person in Alabama history to hold all 4 of the state's highest offices: Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, and Governor. Don Siegelman seemed destined for even greater things. Instead, his prosecution would ignite a firestorm that reached all the way to the White House. Don Siegelman was born in 1946 in Mobile, Alabama, the son of a modest family. He worked his way through the University of Alabama, served in the Air National Guard, and earned his law degree from Georgetown. His political ascent was meteoric. By his 40s, he'd climbed every rung of Alabama's political ladder, serving with distinction in multiple positions. In 1998, he won the governorship running on an education lottery platform designed to fund universal pre-kindergarten programs. Siegelman was charismatic, articulate, and genuinely popular across party lines. During his tenure, he recruited major manufacturers like Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai to build plants in Alabama, creating thousands of jobs. He championed education reform and economic development. His approval ratings remained solid. To many Alabamians, he represented hope for a state often overshadowed by its troubled past. But federal prosecutors saw something entirely different. They believed Siegelman was running a pay-to-play operation from the governor's mansion. At the center of their case was Richard Scrushy, the flamboyant CEO of Health South Corporation, a massive healthcare company based in Birmingham. In 1999, Scrushy made 2 payments totaling $500,000 to a foundation supporting Siegelman's lottery campaign. Shortly afterward, Siegelman reappointed Scrushy to Alabama's Certificate of Need Review Board, a regulatory body with direct oversight of Health South's business operations. Prosecutors argued this was a straightforward bribe, money for appointment. But there was a complication. Scrushy had served on that same board under 3 previous Republican governors without controversy. The appointment wasn't unusual. The timing, however, raised eyebrows. The investigation expanded to include other allegations. Prosecutors claimed Siegelman had engaged in a separate scheme with Alabama businessman Clayton Lanny Young, exchanging official favors for cash and property. They alleged he'd obstructed justice by attempting to cover up these arrangements. The case became deeply politicized almost immediately. The U.S. attorney prosecuting Siegelman was married to the campaign manager of Siegelman's Republican opponent in the 2002 election, a glaring conflict of interest that went unaddressed. Allegations emerged that Karl Rove, President George W. Bush's political strategist, had discussed targeting Siegelman with Justice Department officials. A Republican lawyer later testified before Congress that she'd been told the presiding judge would hang Don Siegelman. The prosecution began to look less like justice and more like a political hit job. Despite the controversy, the case proceeded to trial in 2006. Federal prosecutors presented their evidence: the $500,000 contribution, the board appointment, testimony from cooperating witnesses. Siegelman's defense argued that campaign contributions and political appointments happened in every administration. This was standard practice, not criminal conduct. The jury deliberated for 11 days on 62 counts before reaching verdicts. On June 29, 2006, they convicted Siegelman on 7 counts: bribery, honest services, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. Scrushy was also convicted. The courtroom erupted. Siegelman's supporters insisted the prosecution was a travesty. Critics declared it a victory against corruption. Judge Mark Fuller sentenced Siegelman to 88 months in prison on June 28, 2007. The judge also imposed a $50,000 fine, plus restitution. Siegelman began serving immediately, though he was released on bond in 2008 pending appeal. In 2012, following appellate review, he was resentenced to 78 months. This time, there would be no delay. Siegelman reported to federal prison in Louisiana, where he served nearly 6 years before his release in February 2017. During his incarceration, more than 100 former state attorneys general, both Democrats and Republicans, petitioned the courts, arguing his prosecution had been tainted by misconduct. Today, Siegelman walks free but remains a convicted felon. He's written a book claiming political persecution and continues advocating for criminal justice reform. Whether he was a corrupt politician or a victim of partisan warfare depends entirely on who you ask. Alabama, meanwhile, moved on. Next, we return to Illinois, because of course we do, where another governor thought the rules didn't apply to him. Number 6. George Ryan. November 8, 1994. A family traveling on an interstate highway in Wisconsin never saw it coming. A piece of metal fell from a semi-truck, struck their minivan, and ignited a fireball that killed 6 children from the Willis family. It was a horrific tragedy. It was also the beginning of the end for an Illinois governor. George Ryan seemed like the epitome of Midwestern political success. Born in 1934 in small-town Illinois, he was a pharmacist's son who worked his way up through local politics. He served in the state legislature, became lieutenant governor, then won election as Secretary of State in 1991, a position he held for 8 years. Ryan was genial, well-connected, and respected. In 1998, he ran for governor as a moderate Republican and won handily. He took office in 1999 with a reputation for competence and bipartisan cooperation. His most famous act as governor would be declaring a moratorium on the death penalty in 2000, citing concerns about wrongful convictions. He commuted every death row inmate's sentence before leaving office, earning him international praise. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee even nominated him. But underneath that progressive legacy lurked something far darker. The corruption began years earlier, during Ryan's tenure as Secretary of State. His office oversaw the issuance of commercial driver's licenses, and Ryan's staffers had turned it into a profit center. The scheme was devastatingly simple. Truck drivers paid bribes to state employees, who would then issue licenses without requiring proper testing or qualifications. Unqualified drivers received credentials they had no business holding. The money flowed upward, eventually landing in Ryan's campaign funds. It wasn't about road safety or public welfare. It was about generating cash for political operations. Licenses were literally for sale, and Ryan's office was the marketplace. Then came that November day in 1994. The truck driver responsible for the Willis family tragedy, Ricardo Guzman, had obtained his commercial license through bribes while Ryan was Secretary of State. He couldn't read English road signs. He shouldn't have been driving, but he'd paid the price, and Ryan's office had delivered the credentials. When investigators examined the crash, they uncovered the bribery scheme, and suddenly everything unraveled. Operation Safe Road, a federal investigation, was launched in 1998. The FBI began methodically dismantling Ryan's network of corruption. 75 people were eventually convicted in connection with the licenses for bribes scandal. Ryan's closest associates went to prison. His own actions came under intense scrutiny. Federal prosecutors discovered the corruption went far beyond driver's licenses. As both Secretary of State and later as governor, Ryan had steered lucrative state contracts and leases to friends and political insiders who'd contributed to his campaigns. He'd accepted cash payments, gifts, luxury vacations, and personal services in exchange for access to his office. He'd used campaign funds to pay personal expenses, violating election law. When the licenses for bribes scheme threatened to expose him, Ryan and his associates allegedly worked to obstruct the investigation. The evidence mounted into an overwhelming portrait of systemic corruption spanning nearly a decade. In December 2003, a federal grand jury indicted Ryan on 22 counts, including racketeering, bribery, extortion, money laundering, and tax fraud. His trial began in September 2005 and lasted 5 months. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, financial records, witness testimony, documents showing the flow of money and favors. The Willis family tragedy loomed over the proceedings, a stark reminder of the real-world consequences of corruption. Ryan's defense argued he was unaware of wrongdoing by subordinates and that political fundraising wasn't criminal. On April 17, 2006, the jury convicted him on all 18 counts they considered. Ryan stood motionless as the verdicts were read. On September 6, 2006, Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer sentenced Ryan to 6.5 years in federal prison. She acknowledged his death penalty work, but noted it couldn't erase years of corruption. Ryan was also fined and ordered to pay restitution. He reported to federal prison in Indiana in November 2007 after exhausting appeals. Behind bars, he remained largely quiet, serving his time without fanfare. Ryan was released in July 2013 after serving 5 years, the remainder under home confinement. He's now in his 90s, living quietly in Illinois. He never expressed genuine remorse, never admitted the full scope of his crimes. The Willis family, meanwhile, has never forgotten the children they lost, victims of a system where bribes mattered more than safety. Our next story takes us back in time to 1970s Illinois, where a governor's corruption conviction made legal history. Number 7. Otto Kerner Jr. He was called Mr. Clean, a decorated war hero, federal judge's son, and governor known for his integrity. Otto Kerner Jr. even led a presidential commission that produced one of the most important civil rights reports in American history. Then, investigators discovered he'd been taking bribes from a racetrack owner, and everything changed. Otto Kerner Jr. was born in 1908 into Chicago's political aristocracy. His father served as Illinois Attorney General, and later as a federal appeals court judge. Young Otto attended Brown University and Northwestern Law School, then distinguished himself as a combat officer in World War II, earning a Bronze Star. He married the daughter of Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, cementing his connection to the city's Democratic machine. In 1954, he became a Cook County judge, building a reputation for fairness and reform-minded rulings on adoption law. When he ran for governor in 1960, he defeated the incumbent by over 500,000 votes. Illinois voters saw him as honest, principled, incorruptible, everything a public servant should be. As governor from 1961 to 1968, Kerner championed progressive causes. He promoted economic development, mental health reform, and civil rights initiatives. His administration brought the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory to Illinois and opened export markets that employed thousands. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson tapped him to lead the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, investigating the urban riots tearing through American cities. The resulting Kerner report delivered a scathing assessment. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It became a bestseller and a landmark document of the civil rights era. Kerner's national profile soared. In 1968, when his wife fell seriously ill, he resigned the governorship to accept President Johnson's nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals. It was, he said, the job he'd always wanted. He seemed destined for the Supreme Court. But Otto Kerner had been playing a dangerous game. Back in 1961, shortly after becoming governor, he'd received a sweetheart deal on racetrack stock. Marjay Everett, manager of Arlington Park and Washington Park racetracks, sold him shares at a steep discount, well below market value. 7 years later, in 1968, Kerner sold those shares for a substantial profit. On paper, it looked like a smart investment. In reality, it was payment for services rendered. During Kerner's governorship, Arlington Park had received extraordinarily favorable racing dates, priority scheduling that maximized profits. The Illinois Department of Transportation had also built 2 highway exits strategically located for racetrack patrons' convenience. Everett hadn't offered those discounted shares out of generosity. She'd been buying influence. The scheme came to light in the most mundane way possible. Everett, believing bribery was simply the cost of doing business in Illinois, deducted the value of the stock arrangement on her federal tax returns as a business expense. IRS auditors noticed. They asked questions. The answers led straight to Governor Kerner. In December 1971, a federal grand jury indicted Kerner on 19 counts of bribery, conspiracy, tax evasion, mail fraud, and perjury. The man once synonymous with integrity now faced prosecution by a young, ambitious U.S. attorney named James R. Thompson, who would later become governor himself. Kerner refused to resign from the federal bench, though he took a leave of absence while drawing full salary. His trial in February 1973 captivated Illinois. The evidence was damning: financial records documenting the stock transactions, testimony about the racing dates, proof of the highway exits. Everett herself testified, though prosecutors carefully avoided labeling her as a briber. Legally, the case focused on Kerner's acceptance and his false statements about it. The defense argued it was an indiscretion, not a crime. Perhaps poor judgment, but nothing criminal. The jury disagreed. On February 19, 1973, they convicted him on 17 of 19 counts. Otto Kerner became the first sitting federal appeals court judge ever convicted of a felony. When the verdict was announced, witnesses said he had to bite his lip to stop it from trembling. Judge Richard Austin sentenced Kerner to 3 years in prison and fined him $50,000. Facing almost certain impeachment, Kerner resigned from the bench on July 22, 1974. He reported to a minimum security prison hospital in Kentucky, still maintaining innocence, still insisting he'd committed no real crime. "I shall always be satisfied that my conscience and my record of loyal and dedicated service as governor were never tarnished," he said. He served only 7 months before being released early when doctors diagnosed terminal lung cancer. On May 9, 1976, Kerner died at age 67. Due to his military service, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full honors, a war hero to the end, despite the conviction. Ironically, the prosecutor who sent him to prison, James Thompson, won election as Illinois governor in 1976, the same year Kerner died. The message was supposed to be clear: corruption would no longer be tolerated. Illinois apparently wasn't listening. Next, we visit another Illinois governor whose crimes were committed after he left office, proving corruption wasn't confined to the Capitol building. Number 8. Dan Walker. He walked across Illinois, literally. During his 1972 campaign, Dan Walker trekked 1,197 miles through the state, shaking hands in diners and farm towns, positioning himself as the people's candidate against the Chicago political machine. He won the governorship as a reformer. But years after leaving office, the man who'd walked among the people would be convicted of fraud committed in the shadows of corporate America. Dan Walker was born in 1922 in Washington, D.C., the son of a store manager. He served in the Navy during World War II, earned his law degree from Northwestern, and built a successful legal career in Chicago. Unlike most Illinois politicians, Walker wasn't part of the Democratic machine run by Mayor Richard J. Daley. He was an outsider, a corporate lawyer who'd never held elected office. In 1972, at age 50, he launched his gubernatorial campaign with a gimmick that became legendary. He walked the entire length of Illinois wearing a red bandana, meeting voters where they lived. The imagery was powerful, a regular guy taking on the corrupt establishment. He defeated the machine's candidate in the primary and won the general election. From 1973 to 1977, Governor Walker championed ethics reform and government transparency, positioning himself as the antidote to Illinois corruption. The irony would later be suffocating. Walker's single term as governor was marked by constant battles with the legislature and the Daley machine. He accomplished some reforms, but made powerful enemies. He chose not to seek re-election in 1976, instead mounting an unsuccessful U.S. Senate campaign. After leaving politics, Walker returned to the business world, eventually joining a savings and loan company in the Chicago suburbs. He became chairman and CEO of First American Savings and Loan of Oak Brook. To outsiders, it appeared he was enjoying a successful post-political career. Behind closed doors, something far different was happening. The savings and loan industry in the 1980s was a hotbed of fraud and mismanagement. Deregulation had opened opportunities for abuse, and unscrupulous operators exploited the system ruthlessly. Walker's institution was no exception. As chairman, he orchestrated a scheme to obtain fraudulent loans by providing false information to lenders. The loans weren't for legitimate business purposes. They were mechanisms for personal enrichment. He misapplied funds, directing money to ventures that benefited himself rather than the institution. When investigators started asking questions, Walker compounded his crimes by lying under oath, committing perjury to cover his tracks. The amounts involved exceeded $1.4 million. Unlike his predecessors in the governor's mansion, Walker's corruption had nothing to do with his time in office. These were purely private crimes committed as a businessman. Federal investigators with the FBI and banking regulators began piecing together the fraud in the mid-1980s. The savings and loan crisis was exploding nationwide, and Walker's institution drew scrutiny. Auditors discovered the false loan applications and traced the flow of money. Witnesses came forward describing the schemes. In 1987, prosecutors offered Walker a choice: fight the charges at trial or plead guilty and receive consideration. Walker, facing overwhelming evidence, chose to plead guilty. On September 22, 1987, he admitted to bank fraud, perjury, and filing false financial statements. The man who'd once walked across Illinois in red bandanas now stood before a federal judge admitting he was a criminal. The sentencing hearing was swift. Judge James Holderman sentenced Walker to 7 years in federal prison and ordered him to make restitution. It was a harsh penalty, reflecting the seriousness of financial crimes that had contributed to the broader savings and loan crisis devastating the American economy. Walker reported to prison quietly, without the media circus that had accompanied his political career. He served just 18 months before being released in 1989 due to failing health. Prison had taken a visible toll on the former governor, who was in his late 60s. Walker largely disappeared from public life after his release. He avoided interviews, declined to write memoirs, and kept an extraordinarily low profile. He died in 2015 at age 92, the only Illinois governor whose corruption occurred entirely outside of office. His case was different from Kerner, Ryan, and Blagojevich. Those men abused their positions as public servants. Walker waited until he left government to commit his crimes, as if he'd restrained himself while in power, only to succumb to temptation later. Illinois, meanwhile, continued its remarkable streak of gubernatorial corruption, as if sending former governors to prison had become a state tradition rather than a cautionary tale. Our next case takes us to Connecticut, where a young, rising political star threw away his career for home improvements and vacations. Number 9. John Rowland. At 37 years old, John Rowland became the youngest governor in Connecticut history. He was handsome, articulate, and ambitious, a Republican star who seemed destined for national office. Instead, he'd become the first Connecticut governor in history to serve prison time, brought down by hot tubs, home renovations, and Las Vegas junkets. John Rowland was born in 1957 in Waterbury, Connecticut, to a working-class Irish-American family. His father was a machinist, his mother a school secretary. Rowland attended Villanova University, earning his degree in 1979, and immediately dove into politics. At just 23, he won election to Connecticut's state legislature. 5 years later, at 28, he became one of the youngest members of Congress when he won a U.S. House seat in 1984. He was a conservative fiscal hawk with boyish charm and big ambitions. In 1994, riding the Republican Revolution wave that swept the country, Rowland won the governorship. He took office in January 1995, positioning himself as a budget-cutting reformer who dragged Connecticut's economy into prosperity. He was re-elected twice more, in 1998 and 2002, each time by comfortable margins. Connecticut's business community adored him. Political analysts whispered about his vice presidential potential. But Rowland had developed expensive tastes. The governor's salary wasn't enough to support the lifestyle he desired, so he began accepting gifts, lots of them. It started small and escalated dramatically. State contractors and businessmen who sought favorable treatment from Connecticut's government began showering Rowland with perks. Free vacations to Las Vegas, Vermont ski resorts, and Florida beaches. Expensive trips on private jets. Then came the big-ticket items. Rowland was renovating his weekend cottage on Bantam Lake, and suddenly contractors started doing work for free or at dramatically reduced rates. A new heating system appeared. The kitchen got upgraded. A hot tub was installed. Contractors billed Rowland for a fraction of the actual costs, writing off the rest as gifts or undocumented expenses. The cottage renovations alone were worth tens of thousands of dollars. The benefactors weren't random admirers. They were individuals and companies doing business with the state of Connecticut. When your company needs regulatory approval or state contracts worth millions, gifting a governor some home improvements is a relatively cheap investment. Rowland knew exactly what he was doing. He accepted these gifts while making decisions that directly benefited the donors. It was textbook corruption, and for years nobody caught on. Rowland covered his tracks carefully, failing to disclose the gifts as required by law and maintaining the fiction that he'd paid full price for the renovations. The scheme began unraveling in 2003 when federal investigators started examining Rowland's financial dealings. Journalists at the Hartford Courant began asking uncomfortable questions about the cottage renovations. How had a governor on a public salary afforded such extensive improvements? Where had the money come from? As reporters dug deeper, the answers became increasingly suspicious. In December 2003, facing mounting pressure, Rowland publicly admitted for the first time that he'd accepted gifts from friends and associates, though he insisted nothing was improper. That admission opened the floodgates. More revelations emerged. Federal prosecutors launched a formal investigation. The Connecticut legislature began discussing impeachment proceedings. Rowland's approval ratings collapsed. By June 2004, the walls had closed in completely. Facing almost certain impeachment and federal indictment, Rowland resigned on June 21st, becoming the first Connecticut governor to leave office under such circumstances. He issued a tearful apology, admitting he'd let people down and made mistakes. 3 months later, prosecutors offered him a deal. On December 23, 2004, Rowland pleaded guilty to a single federal corruption charge, depriving the citizens of Connecticut of honest services. He admitted accepting $107,000 in gifts and vacations from state contractors in exchange for official favors. The plea agreement spared him a lengthy trial but guaranteed prison time. On March 18, 2005, Judge Peter Dorsey sentenced Rowland to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison, plus 4 months of house arrest. The judge noted that while Rowland had accomplished some positive things as governor, his corruption had betrayed public trust. Rowland was also ordered to pay $85,000 in fines and restitution. He reported to federal prison in Pennsylvania in April 2005. He served 10 months before being released in February 2006 to complete house arrest at his home. Throughout his incarceration, he maintained a relatively low profile, avoiding media attention. After completing his sentence, Rowland attempted a comeback. He became a radio talk show host, offering political commentary on Connecticut issues. Then, remarkably, in 2014, he was arrested again, this time for conspiracy and falsifying documents related to 2 congressional campaigns where he'd hidden his consulting work. He pleaded guilty and served additional prison time. Apparently, 1 federal conviction hadn't been enough of a lesson. Today, Rowland remains a cautionary tale about squandered potential, the youngest governor in state history who threw it all away for home improvements and vacations. Finally, we head to Washington, D.C., where a beloved civil rights leader turned mayor became the most infamous politician caught on camera in American history. Number 10. Marion Barry. January 18, 1990. A hotel room in downtown Washington, D.C. Hidden cameras rolling. FBI agents listening from the next room. And a mayor about to make one of the most infamous mistakes in American political history. All captured on videotape that would be broadcast around the world. Marion Barry's story began far from the corridors of power. Born in 1936 in Itta Bena, Mississippi, he grew up in crushing poverty, picking cotton and working multiple jobs just to survive. His father died when he was 4, leaving his mother to raise 8 children alone. Barry excelled academically despite the obstacles, earning a master's degree from Fisk University in 1960. But his true calling emerged during the Civil Rights Movement. He became the first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizing sit-ins and protests across the South. He was beaten, arrested, and threatened, but never wavered. In 1965, he moved to Washington, D.C., bringing his activist energy to the nation's capital. He won a seat on the school board in 1970, then the city council in 1974. In 1978, Marion Barry was elected mayor of Washington, D.C., the first prominent civil rights leader to become chief executive of a major American city. As mayor, Barry transformed Washington. He launched economic development initiatives that built a thriving black middle class in a city that had long been divided by race and poverty. He created the Summer Youth Employment Program, giving thousands of young people their first jobs. He brought major construction projects to the city, shopping centers, the convention center, Washington Harbor. Barry was charismatic, quotable, and genuinely beloved by many residents, especially in the city's poorest wards. He won re-election in 1982 and again in 1986. But underneath the political success, Barry was struggling with addiction. Rumors of substance use had circulated for years, whispered in bars and hinted at in newspapers. Associates noticed erratic behavior, unexplained absences, paranoia. Barry denied everything, dismissing the gossip as racist attacks designed to undermine a successful black politician. The FBI had been watching closely. They developed evidence that Barry was using illicit substances, and in January 1990, they prepared an elaborate sting operation. They enlisted Rashida Moore, a former model who knew the mayor, convincing her to cooperate in exchange for leniency in her own legal troubles. On January 18th, Moore invited Barry to her room at the Vista International Hotel. Hidden cameras were recording. Agents were positioned nearby. Moore offered Barry a pipe, and he accepted. What happened next was captured in grainy video that would become infamous. Barry smoking crack cocaine, completely unaware he was being recorded. Within minutes, FBI agents burst into the room. Barry was arrested on the spot. The footage would later be played in courtrooms and on news broadcasts worldwide. A sitting mayor caught red-handed engaging in criminal behavior. The arrest sent shockwaves through Washington. Barry initially refused to resign, insisting he'd been set up, that the FBI had targeted him because of his race and his advocacy for D.C. statehood. His supporters rallied around him, viewing the prosecution as persecution. His critics demanded immediate resignation. The city fractured along racial and political lines. Barry ultimately decided not to seek re-election in 1990, but he did run as an independent for an at-large city council seat. His trial began in June 1990, and prosecutors presented the devastating video evidence. Barry's attorneys argued entrapment, that Moore had lured him into criminal behavior he wouldn't have otherwise committed. The jury watched the footage repeatedly. On August 10, 1990, the jury reached a partial verdict. They convicted Barry on a single misdemeanor count of cocaine possession, but deadlocked on more serious charges. It was a mixed result, technically a conviction, but far less severe than prosecutors had hoped for. On October 26, 1990, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson sentenced Barry to 6 months in federal prison and fined him $5,000. The judge said Barry had given aid, comfort, and encouragement to the drug culture in Washington and violated the public trust. Barry addressed the court, offering apologies, but maintaining the prosecution was unjust. Barry reported to federal prison in Petersburg, Virginia, in October 1991. He served his full 6-month sentence, emerging in April 1992 with a remarkable plan. Instead of retreating from public life, he immediately ran for a city council seat representing Ward 8, the city's poorest area. He won with 71% of the vote in the primary and 90% in the general election. His supporters saw him as redeemed, a man who'd overcome personal struggles. 2 years later, in 1994, Barry mounted an even more audacious comeback. He ran for mayor again. Incredibly, he won, returning to the office he'd left in disgrace 4 years earlier. He served a 4th term from 1995 to 1999, though his administration struggled with financial crises and ongoing controversies. Barry continued serving on the city council until his death on November 23, 2014, at age 78 from heart disease. Despite multiple subsequent arrests and ethical violations over the years, he remained a beloved figure to many Washington residents who saw him as a champion of the poor and marginalized. His funeral drew thousands, and a statue commemorates his legacy. Marion Barry's story remains one of the most extraordinary in American politics, a civil rights hero who fell spectacularly, then rose again, proving that in Washington, D.C., redemption was always possible. These 10 cases represent some of the most dramatic falls from grace in American political history. Leaders who betrayed the public trust and paid the price, though some walked away far more easily than their victims ever could.